Hi, everyone. We will get started in a few minutes. I'll just let everyone kind of file in. Sorry to put my robot eating on camera, but I just bought grapes, so. I hope everyone is having a good Tuesday. I am. Still pretty cold here in Toronto. Not freezing, but we're not really in May weather yet, which is kind of strange. I'm gonna move the microphone so you can maybe hear me better. That's probably better. For those of you who are already here, I'll just let you know it's really warm in Brandon. That's lovely. I got some kind of exciting news this week. I got a new job that I'm starting in the fall, and I'll be moving to Kelowna, BC, which is like notoriously beautiful. And I keep checking their weather, and it's like 20 degrees. I don't move until the end of the summer, but I'm really excited about the weather. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really jazzed. I'm really, really excited. And it's, I'm teaching like cultural studies and media studies. And I was just thinking back to the day we did gender and media, which is like such a fun class. And I had a moment of first of all, I want to use that class again because it's the first time I've taught Modern Family. And I thought it worked so well that I was so excited by all of your the observations you all made. So I'm definitely going to use that again. It got me excited to teach that kind of stuff because I haven't had a chance to teach. I usually I bring in a lot of media in my teaching, but I haven't really had a chance to focus on it kind of exclusively. So yeah, I'm pretty jazzed. So if anyone is headed to UBC Okanagan, maybe I'll see you there. Okay, we're just gonna wait a few more minutes. As I was saying, the way I want to start today is I want to just check in about the term paper because I talked about it yesterday and we had a chance to start the discussion, but I also recognize that many of you were still kind of in the media studies headspace or the media response headspace, and I'm very excited to read them. I always forget to silence my phone. It's a great teachable moment. Yeah, so I want to reserve some time today to check in about that and see if there are any preliminary questions. And I'm going to go over just the kind of how I approach writing it. I'm going to talk a little bit about forming a thesis, but we're going to do some more kind of planned activities around that either tomorrow or Thursday, kind of depending on how the schedule shakes out. But there will definitely be, I think I said this yesterday, is that like, I don't want it to just be like, I give you the assignment and then I don't talk about it again until you hand it in. I hope that every class we're able to check in about how your work is going. And so this is kind of a scaffolded thing. Okay, so it's about 3 minutes after, so I'm going to get started. And first thing I'll say, I'm going to, can I do this? Hold on. Do this. Okay, I'm going to try and put a file in the chat. So stay with me. I'll see if it works. I don't know how to do that. Okay. So I made a new section in Moodle. This is something I really should have done before. I now realize it would have been really helpful, I think, with the media assignment. Basically, I made a section for assignments, and it's in the same place you see all of the weeks. So right above the intro week, there's now a new kind of like week box that just has information for assignments. So I've uploaded a file that has a description of what the term paper is. It's exactly the same thing that I put in the slide yesterday. It has your instructions. Can I really not put a description? I really can't use okay, I guess I can. I really thought I'd be able to put an attachment in the chat. That's bonkers. So if you go to your Moodle right now, or if you have your notes from yesterday, it's a quick reference and you can kind of check on that as you're working. I am going to open it up on my end. Are there any questions about the term paper, just kind of what you've seen so far? You can just raise your hand and start talking, or you can put it in the chat if there are any questions about that.
Should we run by you like our thesis before we start writing it, or does it?
If you're doing one of the if you're doing one of the first 5 prompts, you don't have to, but you absolutely can.
Okay, just some direction and help.
Yes. I mean, I think the thing about a thesis is that like with if you don't have a strong thesis, it makes the rest of the paper just really kind of hard to do because it is your foundation. So if you're wondering at all, you can just email it to me, or if you want to chat in office hours, yeah, it's a great thing to do.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. But you don't have to if you're worried about time to the others. Anything else?
I see Victoria has something in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Oh, here we go. So the question is, can we use more than 2 or 3 sources? For example, I want to use 2 or 3 major sources, but I want to use smaller quotes and examples from other readings that might be relevant to the essay. I'm going to recommend that you don't do that, only because this is like 2,000 words is actually in kind of the world of paper writing still pretty short. And I would like for you to be able to go into depth about the specific topics you're dealing with the and with engaging with the material. If you're using more than 3 sources, it just gets very hard in my experience to go into like substantial depth. It's even kind of a challenge in the page count I've given you, or the word count rather. With 3, 3 is, I say, pretty ambitious. 2 is a little safer, but 3 is okay. Yeah, but I would recommend that you don't go any higher than that, just because you can kind of end up just like skimming a lot of the surface and not going too deep on any one thing. A good question. There's a question about MLA format. So yeah, we are gonna talk about this also this week. I think I probably should do it this week rather than next week. So I think tomorrow I'll really go into like what makes a good thesis in detail, and we'll play good thesis, bad thesis. And then on Thursday, I will cover MLA format. I recommend, so there are lots of, unfortunately, this is like a weird thing about academia. There are quite a few different styles to cite in, and they all have these like very particular rules that I find very frustrating as a writer, as an editor, because like every journal will use a slightly different format, and like, why are there so many? MLA is really common in the humanities, and I just kind of find that like many upper year humanities courses default to MLA, so it's a great thing to get handy in. If you already know a style and you're comfortable with it, use it. I think the two most common kind of in our world are MLA and Chicago. Chicago is more common in the US, not surprisingly. So if you don't have a style already, I would say MLA or Chicago. If you already know a style that's not listed and you want to use it, that's fine. I would say just like if you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's fine because this is an intro class. Wait until we go over this on Thursday, and if you still have questions, I'm happy to answer more specific questions. If you're curious and you want to look at it before Friday, I mean, you can just Google like MLA citation style. And it really just refers to like a style guide is just kind of the way you reference a quotation or reference, because obviously every time you reference a text or quote a text directly, you have to do the thing where you put in quotation marks and then you put, parenthesis after with the author's name. And then you format your works cited list. And there are all these different rules about what goes in the parenthesis, what goes in the works cited list, the order things happen in. And unfortunately, part of academic writing is that those fairly arbitrary rules do matter. Like citation is really important because intellectual property is very much a thing and a lot of labor goes into it. And very often people who produced academic texts and studies are not very well paid. So it's really important that we at least give them credit. Because in a lot of ways, that is how they get paid, is just getting their names kind of honored for their work. But the rules around, the different ways are like kind of annoying, but it is kind of part of the deal with academia, unfortunately. It's like, welcome to the party.
So are we going to use any other sources apart from the readings that you provided? Because the instruction on the term paper said it should be on the readings.
That's correct. Yeah. So you're only going to be using, you're not going to do any additional research. You're just using readings from this course, but you still need to cite them.
Okay. So you're saying any citation we're comfortable with?
Yeah, any citation style, absolutely. There are lots of other ones, and if you've used one before that you like, totally fine with that, as long as it's like a recognized
okay
one. You can't make up your own.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so what I would like you to do is we're going to start off. So the last few days I've kind of started off by talking a lot, and I'm still going to talk a lot today because that's kind of my thing. Oh, I have a new question. Do you want us to use footnotes or endnotes? Chicago style. Okay, so if you use Chicago style, Chicago has options. This is pretty advanced, so if this is not in your wheelhouse yet, don't worry about it. But if you're aware of Chicago, Chicago has the option of using footnotes or endnotes or kind of parenthetical citations. Up to you. I don't care, as long as it's kind of you're following a standard way, and pick a style that kind of works for your style of writing. Cool, thanks. So what I would like everyone to do now is we're going to do some work with your discussion questions. I also just wanted to remind you, I'm sure everyone knows this, but you have another reading response that is due this Thursday, because we do one every week. So you should still be collecting. You should be kind of like generating and holding on to your discussion questions every day. You should be making note of my key term definitions, and you should also pick a reading from this week to summarize. So make sure you do that for Thursday. Because you are doing that, hopefully you have some discussion questions for today. If you don't, I'm just going to give us 2 minutes to jot down a discussion question, and then we're going to do some small group work. So I'll give you 2 minutes. If you've already done this, you brought them, that's fine. You could just kind of like reflect on them if you want to maybe brainstorm some things you'd like to talk about. If you didn't bring discussion questions today, that's fine. Take those 2 minutes and just reflect on the readings you did and see if you can come up with a question you'd like to talk about, a reading that kind of resonated with you, something you remember, something you noticed. I mean, I recognize that this is a pretty high stakes day in terms of the topics we're talking about. So, go as deep into that as you're comfortable with, but just try and take a minute and think of something you'd like to discuss today. And you have 2 minutes. Okay, so I would just ask you to wrap up whatever you're writing, land to the plane, and just kind of finish that sentence. So I'm now going to put you in small groups and take about 10 minutes and just share what you wrote. If you came in late, didn't have a chance to get something down, just talk about something it can be as simple as something I read in the reading that I remember, like the first thing that kind of jumps to your head. But if you do have more specific questions about things you didn't understand, things you want more information on, or just things you have like a response to, that works great. Give me a moment. Okay, so I will give you 10 minutes. I'll give you a 2-minute warning when I'm going to bring you back into the room, and then you'll have a chance to come join us. Okay. Sending you in. welcome back. Wait for everyone to rejoin us. We're almost back. So as we've done in the past, I'm just gonna wait one more minute while everyone rejoins. Okay. So what I'd like now is, I hope that was a good chat. If you'd like to share what you wrote about, like, you could just share your own question that you brought to the class, or if you want to talk about what you talked about in the group kind of collectively, you can share that in the group chat, or you can share it out loud over your camera. So I'll just give you a minute if you'd like to type those in. I'm curious to see kind of how you're coming at this before I do my my spiel.
Like my group, we kind of had an interesting topic. Interesting discussion. We were talking about how mostly, like in the academia world, all of this can be integrated, and like people should learn about it at a younger, or not, sorry, not younger, but at a lower level.
Mm-hmm.
Where, and what I mean by that is in high school, because, and I feel like with high school, you're kind of premature to understand these things. At the same time, it is free. It is, publicly and so compared to university, you have to pay for these courses to actually be able to understand them. And you have to be willing to seek out, and you have to spend money. But when it's integrated into the academic world, you don't have to do that because it's mandatory. And even if you don't want to learn about it in depth, you can learn about the basics about it, like basic terminology, and it teaches you how to live your life with other people. It teaches you a lot of things. And even because some people don't even go to university after high school,
Mm-hmm.
but to have that knowledge, it is free. And I feel like some people just, like the older generation, they just don't want people to learn about these stuff because it's controversy, or they just don't want to include it because it's seen as something that's out of the standard norm, which I think, as I said, with our generation, like millennials and Gen Z, they're so like active on social media, and they're so active on these topics that even I think they're kind of, what's the word, like they're kind of raising awareness on their own,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not, included in academia.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I totally agree. Really good point too about the fact that when this when learning about colonialism and colonial violence is only taught at a university level, yeah, that really blocks access to that education because, as you said, not everyone goes to university. It creates a pay barrier between this kind of knowledge and information. And there's also, I think also in terms of like doing it at the high school level, the thing about a high school education is that it tends to be fairly broad, and there's more of a mandate of all students getting kind of a basic education. Another real barrier to this kind of like educational advocacy work is that even at a university level, if you don't take a class on colonialism, you might not learn this. It's very, very easy in Canada to do a full university degree without learning this. And it can, it creates an interesting philosophy of like what is the role of education and post-secondary education in like raising this consciousness. And if students have to opt in to take it, and students have to kind of major in like a social justice based program in order to learn this. Yeah, someone also is talking about the fact that at university level slavery is rarely discussed. Absolutely. like when I did university not too long ago, you know, I'm about a decade behind you folks, and I did not learn about, and I was in the arts. You know, I took, you know, English and theater and like cultural studies classes, and I did not learn about the residential school system. I did, at the very least, learn, like read authors and playwrights from Indigenous communities in Canada, but like we didn't learn about residential schools. We did not talk about slavery, despite the fact that I took a lot of Canadian content courses. I took a Canadian lit class that was like, excuse me, talked about like a lot of like frontier women and pioneer women. We did not talk about slavery as part of colonial expansion. So I agree. It's really frustrating. But I think to Heba, to your point, there is, I agree that in general, social media does provide at least the potential for increased awareness and access. And that's something that actually we all, like in this virtual room, do have a certain amount of agency in. And a lot of kind of social justice education, and we're talking about this a lot this week, a lot of social justice education usually doesn't come top down. It actually comes from community members and from maybe more like collective approach to education and information. And that's something that we can participate in. It doesn't let you know, formal education governments off the hook, but it is a way, I think, of us like contributing positively to that. So I hope that's something that folks can get from this class. And that did kind of inform the way I teach this too, the fact that this is not common knowledge. I think especially around the film we're watching this week, that I mean, this is a week where I do maybe pivot a little bit from a specific gender focus, and part of that is the knowledge is that I don't know when everyone here will get another chance to engage with this, and I think it's worth doing. So I'm willing to kind of like soften the focus of the class for today. I mean, we're still primarily talking about gender, and there's a lot of things to talk about in gender and colonialism, but I'm also trying to make space for colonialism education, just in case, like, if this is your only one of your few arts and humanities classes, you might not get a chance to talk about this. So did anyone else want to share anything that they talked about in the group? I do see some people in the chat talking about kind of just agreeing with the first point that Heba made about like lack of education and lack of awareness and lack of discussion that kind of happens in like high school and universities. Someone else talked about the fact that health is something they discussed. The fact that HIV percentages are so high in Indigenous youth. Absolutely, yeah, and I think this really speaks to like the intersectionality of all of these issues and of social issues that affect marginalized community and affect women. Again, I think it's important, like, you know, like I do organize each class into kind of a theme and topic, but there is so much overlap. And that is kind of the point. So like today we're like, technically we're focusing on colonialism as a force, but we're talking about health and we're talking about violence. And in the, you know, on Thursday when we talk about violence, we'll also talk about health and colonization and race. And like next week when we're talking about queer identity, we will continue to talk about like racialized people and two-spirit identity. So it all does, it's all connected. It does all intersect, and me kind of picking topics each day it is a pedagogical tool because I'm trying to organize this in a way that like lets us focus on kind of one thing at a time, because I'm trying to help folks understand things and then build on it, but to also understand that those barriers are a little bit arbitrary. You know, they're there to help you kind of break things down a bit, but we do all put it back together at the end. We talked about the fact that there is a lack of statistics around two-spirit people. So statistics is, I mean, could I do a whole class on how interesting would a whole day on statistics be? I don't know, but I think a really good thing to think about that we don't have a reading on, but just to be aware of, is the way statistics are formed, particularly around marginalized people. That statistics are collected by people in power. They do tend to reproduce colonial values and power and have a way of silencing people. Such a big part of statistics is self-identification. And so people who don't come forward, or people who are not asked to come forward, or people who come forward and their data doesn't kind of work within the framework of the data collectors, those things get erased. If we think about like historic representation, one thing that I've looked at a lot in my own work, and I continue to kind of be sadly fascinated by, is when we look at history of marginalized people, there are very few records, because historically marginalized people haven't been able to record their own history. Their ability to record their own history has been like violently oppressed. They are very often, and so the records we get come from very strange and problematic ways. So like one thing that the reading this week on racism, or on slavery in Canada, talked about was the fact that actually a lot of our records we get a lot of our records about slaves escaping and resistance. We actually get that from basically wanted posters and newspaper articles about slaves who had escaped. And so like those documents were generated not to document resistance, they were documented to help slave owners like recapture slaves who had run away. But we have so little representation of that data that we do kind of rely on these like oppressive records. We're going to talk about that also when we talk about trans history, the fact that, like, again, marginalized people are kind of written about, but they don't get to write their own stories. And so we, as historians who look at marginalized people, we often have to kind of reverse engineer histories. And it's very often pieced together through kind of like court documents, newspaper clippings that are often pretty like problematic and written from an outside perspective. Like police records are another place we get a lot of like people who have been over policed, populations that have been over policed. That's a place we get records from, but it's very, yeah. Oh, words. Yes, I'm getting some people agreeing with me, which is always nice. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna jump in. Thank you again for doing this discussion work at the beginning. It kind of gives me a great sense of where we are as a group. Just do the thing. Or share my screen. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, I'm frozen. Oh no. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. I'm just gonna try and get this back. That was scary. I'm gonna close some windows. I think I'm overdoing my computer's bandwidth here. I don't want to lose you. All right, one more time. Okay, that's better. Okay, so today we are talking about gender colonialism. It is May 11th. So some key terms I'd like us to look at today and that you can jot down right now are settler colonialism, the Indian Act, enfranchisement, that should say enfranchisement, I'm sorry. Two-spirit, and paternalism, and specifically paternalism as it refers to colonialism and colonization. Before we jump in, I do want to talk about like the concept of land as it relates to this topic of colonialism. So this is a resource that I think is really fantastic, and it's so, I think, particularly poignant in a class like this because we're not in the same physical space. So this is a website, nativeland.ca, where you can actually find out who the traditional tribes and caretakers of the land that you live on are. This is below, we just see a kind of a clip of like a cross stitch of North America. I mean, one thing to notice is that this map does not use the kind of traditional borders that we're used to seeing on maps that define land based in terms of colonization. So provinces and states don't show up in these. There's also an overlap. Then there are multiple overlaps because of the way land was kind of organized and shared. Also because records have been erased. I do want to touch on the fact that, as I said, I'm in Toronto. You may have been in classes or been to events where people do a land acknowledgement. This can be really polarizing. Some people find this a really important, respectful thing to do, and that speaks to the importance of taking responsibility and acknowledging colonialism. Some people see this more as lip service. And I think especially when we kind of see this done at the beginning of something and then it's never kind of mentioned again. So I do want to do a land acknowledgement for where I am. As I said, I'm in Toronto, and the part of Ontario that I'm in traditionally is the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Those are the people who have traditionally cared for this land. It has been the meeting place of peoples for thousands and thousands of years, long before the land was colonized. I do have really a lot of gratitude and a lot of really complicated feelings about my relationship to colonization. I'm doing this in today's class because I think it's really important that land acknowledgements don't become just kind of a piece of housekeeping, and that we do carry this conversation forward. So I'm intentionally doing this on the day where we start the conversation about colonization. This is not going to be the last day we talk about colonization. This is the intro day, but this is a recurring theme of the class, and really should be a recurring theme of any kind of form of education that intersects with culture or with history or with certainly cultural studies or social justice. So, I mean, I recommend taking a look at nativeland.ca. The other thing I'll just say about my own positionality in this, and one of the words that I kind of flagged for you is settler colonial, is the idea that very often when we think of the term settler, we might think of people who originally colonized the land. And I've certainly heard people like European descended people kind of talk about the fact that like they're not colonizers because they did not literally colonize this land. Either because like growing up in the 21st century, they did not participate actively in the settling of the land, or even that that they're first or second generation Canadians, so their ancestors didn't even participate in that. So the thing with that is that colonization is an ongoing process, and by continuing to live in a colonized a culture that is based on colonialism, and as European descendants, I benefit from that system, and so do other people of European descent living in Canada. I'm also first and second generation Canadian. So my dad was born in Scotland. My mom was born here, but her parents were born in England. So my ancestors technically did not actively participate in colonization. However, when my ancestors were living in England, in which England benefited greatly from colonization and the wealth that colonization produced, and when my family moved to Canada seeking, like my dad's family came here because they were looking for kind of better work opportunities. They came to a place that had a thriving economy based on slavery and colonization. So my family was able to benefit from colonialism because colonialism created a country that gave opportunities to white people who were seeking it. So that's my positionality in colonialism and how I kind of position myself as a settler colonizer. In general, today, a big part of this discussion obviously is around language and some of the words we use. I'm going to supersize this. Sorry, 1 second. Just realized I'm only sharing part of my screen. There we go. Okay, so the language we're using is important, and I understand that if you have not been educated in this, and as we were saying earlier, there's not a lot of formal education done on colonization, and certainly Indigenous knowledges are not taught a lot in high school or even university. So there are lots of different kind of words you'll see used. A common question people do ask is, what is the correct term in terms of looking at words like Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native, or First Nations? The short answer is it's complicated. So any of these terms potentially are quote unquote the correct term. Indigenous is a word that is used increasingly globally, and that's a reason it's actually starting to take up more usage. Aboriginal has been used a lot in Canada, but it's actually starting to be slightly replaced by Indigenous just because it makes sense in a global context. First Nations is often used. The term Native is used a lot less in formal documents and is I don't believe is understood to be pejorative, but is maybe a little more casual. So in a lot of your readings that we've done this week and next week, you will see these words used, sometimes seemingly interchangeably. I think a few things to keep in mind around language when it comes to Indigenous peoples is that all of these terms are essentially umbrella terms. None of these are names of tribes or specific people or words that Indigenous people used prior to colonization. So all of these terms are the result of colonization. And they're umbrella terms that refer to large groups in a very generalizing way. In terms of the correct, quote unquote, correct language to use, it's really important to look at the language that Indigenous peoples use to self-identify and to let that be a guide. So rather than trying to find a kind of one-size-fits-all or a really easy how-to, as you continue to read works by Indigenous authors or kind of follow Indigenous people online, just paying attention to the language that Indigenous people use. And that's a really good guide, I think, rather than kind of an easy answer. Unfortunately, I can't give you a very simple answer, and it's not supposed to be simple. The other thing about language, obviously in this week, we are going to talk about problematic language, and that's kind of unavoidable. So I do want to just draw our attention, and these come into the readings as well. Some of the, and I realize some of this might be triggering for folks. So words like mulatto, master, Indian, and Radaki. So the term mulatto refers to a person of like a mixed race person, usually a person who is both Black and white. It is a derogatory term. We don't use it anymore. And it does kind of focus on someone's mixed race identity in a problematic, essentializing way. It kind of became a more sexualized term in the 20th century. The term master, so most of the readings we saw this week on slavery use the term owner, which is still horrifying because the idea that slaves and human beings were considered property is terrible, but it is also accurate of that system. The term master tends to kind of reinforce the narrative of slavery and can be kind of legitimizing. I mean, that is the language of slavery itself. So we and I try not to use that term when talking about people who held power over slaves. The term Indian, we know is no longer used. It is, I mean, it's literally the language of the first colonizers and Christopher Columbus, who quite literally thought he was in India and so just called everyone Indians, and that became a thing, which is bizarre. History is so weird. So we don't use that term anymore. However, you will notice that a lot of a lot of documents use that word. A lot of organizations and government bodies that were founded, decades or centuries ago do use that word. So, I mean, the language is tricky because language changes, and sometimes historic or outdated language does get connected to institutions or documents, and so it kind of remains in currency. We don't use it anymore casually or socially. We don't use it anymore to refer to people. Some Indigenous people do use this word, and that's obviously like their agency to do so. And we refer to some historical documents or government bodies, we use this word, but in terms of identifying other human beings, we don't. The last term is Burdaki, and Burdaki was a term that early colonizers used to kind of make sense of Indigenous people whose gender identity didn't fit into a binary. We'll talk about this towards the end of the lecture, but that there were in almost every Indigenous community examples of people who didn't who did not self-identify as male or female in a way that made sense to colonial people. And so Radaki was not a word from any Indigenous community, because Indigenous cultures had their own terms and concepts for this. Radaki was kind of a colonial word to kind of make sense of that. And it was derogatory. And it was not a term of self-identification. So it's not a word we use. It's never really been used super popularly in popular culture, but it certainly was used academically for a very long time in a way that kind of erased people's ability to self-identify. So first, I want to talk about the first reading, which is on slavery in Canada. Someone was mentioned, a few people mentioned in the group discussion we did at the beginning, and certainly a big theme of quite a few of these readings is cultural amnesia. So that Canada does not talk about its history of slavery very much at all, both in terms of education in universities, but also just as a culture, we don't talk about it. And there's actually been a lot of work done by the government of Canada and kind of Canada's PR system to suppress that discussion and replace it with a really self-valorizing depiction of Canada as being this kind of like white savior of slavery. So it's contrasted a lot with the Underground Railroad, which is a part of Canada's history, and that tends to kind of stand in for slavery. And it's very often contrasted with American slavery, because when in popular culture or in kind of even a lot of academic, the kind of academic imagination, we might call it, when people think of slavery, they often think specifically of American slavery, because Canadian slavery looked different and intersected with the economics of colonialism differently. It often isn't recorded. So I think it's useful always to have a definition of slavery. Slavery is the robbery of one's freedom and labor by another, and usually by a powerful person. Sorry, that's another typo. Usually using violence or coercion. Both Indigenous people and Black people were enslaved in Canadian colonialism. Colonialism is a tool of, slavery is a tool of colonialism. It was a way of robbing non-white people of their humanity, and it was also like an economic tool, a big motivating factor for the use of slavery in Canada. As with the US, is that it was necessary for the economics of colonization. Colonizing a place, taking over a place and enforcing an ethnic identity upon it takes a lot of labor. And so to have an enslaved workforce was a way for colonizers to do that in a way that sustained their economy. A big difference the reading discusses between Canada and the US, because early American economics were so much about agriculture. Like in the South, cotton was such a major export and an economic force, that slavery was very much defined by manual agricultural labor. And so a lot of the most popular common tropes of slavery tend to be around agriculture in Canada, because Canada's primary economic driving force in the early kind of century of colonialism was the fur trade. There is less of a kind of industrialized agricultural slavery. There are still absolutely enslaved peoples working in agricultural settings, but it's not quite, it's not the driving force of the Canadian economy. So a lot more slavery takes the form of domestic slavery, or kind of like specialized trade slavery, but it doesn't kind of have the same kind of like image in pop culture. And that actually makes it a lot, that's I think part of the violence of Canadian cultural amnesia is because Canadian slavery didn't look like American slavery. It's a lot easier to deny. So the Code Noir refers to a code. Keep in mind that a large portion of Canada was initially colonized by France, and they imported, in addition to slaves, also a lot of their policies around slavery. So the Code Noir actually comes from the West Indies and was never made law in Canada, but was used by French colonizers in much the same way. It classified enslaved people in the same category as livestock, as furniture and trade goods. Which is horrifying, to think that enslaved people were thought about property, not in the abstract, but also were regulated as such. I was watching, I've recently started catching up on an episode of The Handmaid's Tale, which is always really difficult to watch, but there's a discussion of one of the women who's recently been freed, and it is an actress of color who plays one of the Marthas, and she's reflecting on her time, and she says, like, do you know, in Gilead I was classified as property, and I was regulated the same way a car would be. And that's a really direct reference to actual slavery practices. And I mean, there's a lot in The Handmaid's Tale that pulls from literal history, but yeah, so that was anyway, I just thought of that. Additionally, there were regulations under the Code Noir of the way owners controlled and regulated the lives of their slaves, as well as the status of children who were born of slaves and into slavery. So at the beginning, I asked you to look for paternalism and paternalistic as a definition. When we say slavery is paternalistic, and this is getting into slightly more abstract concepts of gender, paternalism, like paternal means like father. So when a system is paternalistic, it has a relationship towards, the object of its control that mirrors the relationship of a father to a child. And that usually, and that's different from maternal, and that usually refers to kind of control, an assumption that the person being on the receiving end of the paternity is not capable of taking care of themselves, tends to infantilize people who are kind of existing under paternity, and it's usually quite about like a domination and authority. So some of the ways that slavery in Canada was paternalistic, in a semi-literal sense, the fact that domestic slavery was such a big part of the Canadian use of slavery is that it was within the home, and so the family patriarch did take on the kind of the head of the household and also the head of slavery. So the idea of a slave owner as a father figure becomes really blurred because it is so connected to the domestic sphere in that way. Owners very often renamed their slaves, very often after themselves. Owners had their slaves baptized and sometimes would literally baptize them themselves, so would take on a kind of religious patriarchal role. And owners often married their slaves. So again, would act as a religious paternal figure, or at the very least would had to give permission. So if slaves did want to marry, they would need the permission of their owner in much the same way that historically women have needed the permission of their fathers to marry. So in a very kind of distorted way, the owner of slaves became this kind of twisted father figure, and that is kind of built into the DNA of slavery. And I mean, like, I think slavery more generally, and I think maybe because of the domestic focus of slavery in Canada, that becomes maybe a little heightened. The way women's bodies are regulated within slavery is also something worth noting. So, for example, children who are born to slaves inherit their mother's slave status and become slaves themselves at birth. We saw in the reading, there were some examples of advertisements, for lack of a better term, for slaves, and very often the children were sold with their mother, which is, again, a horrifying sentence. And their skills would very often augment the mother's domestic labor skills. So potentially having children might increase the quote unquote value of an enslaved woman. Sexual assault and rape were common by owners, particularly within domestic labor. Again, as we talked about, that when kind of slavery or when slavery happens in a domestic setting, and when there is kind of a blurred between the domestic and that kind of forced labor, that sexual assault becomes very, very common. The way paternity functioned among slaves was purely within the matrimonial line. So again, a child is defined by the racial status of their mother. So if a white either slave owner or just a white person sexually assaulted, raped a slave, that child's technical biracial status was not acknowledged. It was not a question of being half black and half white. It was a question of if you were at all black, then you were black and you were a slave. Yeah. So I'm going to pivot into the discussion of colonization in terms of the colonization of Indigenous lands in Canada. I was going to take a break, but I think I'll keep going because I do want to, I want to leave space for to talk about the film before we watch it. And so thank you for staying with the tour. So the colonization of what is now known as Canada began in 1608, at the time what was known as New France. Initially, only men were asked to participate in treaty negotiation and signing away land. This I have so many typos. I'm so sorry. I'm going to fix this. This should say that women traditionally in very many tribes and bands did control land rights. So the omission of women from any negotiation with colonizers was both a form of obviously the gendered aspect of colonization, and was also a strategy to deny women the power to protect lands. It did actually make it easier for colonizers to gain access to lands. It's probably worth saying that a major driving force behind colonization in general was access to natural resources. Canada had an abundance of natural resources that colonizing nations wanted. And so the project of colonization and this like very multi-layered, complicated dance of domination and genocide was fundamentally about getting access to those resources. And we continue to see that today with access to lands and things like oil pipelines. That fundamentally this is about colonizing access to resources that European people do not own, and finding ways of removing people that stand in their way. The reading also talks about the fact that alcohol was kind of seen as a form of chemical welfare, and it was one of the ways in which concentrated alcohol was introduced into communities with the knowledge that it would destabilize communities and that it would have ill effects on those communities. Considering how religious European culture was at this time and the attitude towards alcohol, that the fact that they would introduce this into a community that they were quote unquote trying to civilize should raise a lot of eyebrows. So when colonization had its contact with Indigenous people and began the process of colonization, again, this was done under the heading of civilizing, and certainly a large part of the rationalization was that as a Christian nation or Christian nations, it was the responsibility of colonizers to civilize Indigenous cultures. And we see this literally around the world. We're focusing on Canada today, but this is very true of like, countless other places and communities and cultures that were colonized. The idea, and again, this is very paternalistic, the idea that Europe, that England and France had a moral responsibility to civilize people that they saw as uncivilized is a very, father-child relationship, and that the colonizers were coming in by force and forcing cultures to give up their way of life because it was what was best for them. So a big part of this too actually did happen along colonial lines, because the way Indigenous peoples were socialized or kind of forced to adapt to a European way of life had a lot to do with the way their gender roles were relegated. So the way that, the fact of like women being relegated to the domestic sphere and men working in manual labor, and that being very strict is a very like European way, and did not reflect the values and the labor division and the space division of Indigenous cultures. And so that enforcement did erase the gender, the existing gendered cultural institutions of Indigenous peoples. Women having less access to leadership, women not having a seat at the table, and kind of teaching Indigenous communities that letting women lead was a sign of weakness, and enforcing rules that robbed women of rights to participate in government was a gendered form of colonial control. And again, it did make it easier, specifically around land issues, for Europeans to seize control of those lands. So is there a question? Okay, I thought I heard something. If anyone does have a question, you are free to jump in, absolutely. And then the regulation of these labors tends to erase gender roles and identities of Indigenous cultures that didn't work or didn't kind of map on one-to-one to a Euro-Christian understanding of what gender identity was. A big part of especially the first few generations of colonization was country marriages. So European women in general were not very common in early colonial settlements. And part of that became the impetus for country marriages. So early colonizers actually would quote unquote marry women. These were common law marriages, so they were not kind of religiously or legally recognized by the European government. So the Indigenous people they married did not know this for the most part. This was a way for colonizing men, one, to receive free labor, because there still was a gender division of labor, and as they created communities, there was a list of things that quote unquote women were supposed to do, and without European women to kind of sustain domestic spheres and caretake, colonizers essentially would bring in their Indigenous wives to fulfill these roles. This also actually facilitated a large amount of access to information. Colonizers did not know about the vegetation of North America, did not understand the weather cycles. The weather was very different across North America than it is in Europe. Didn't know enough about fur trading, didn't know enough about the wildlife. And so these colonial marriages were a way of essentially giving colonizers access to Indigenous knowledges through their wives. It was also really promoted amongst colonizing governments, because it was seen a way of curtailing sexually transmitted diseases and kind of like unregulated pregnancy. If colonizers came and had one specific wife, the idea that monogamy and fidelity would control the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, and that any children they did have would kind of work in some form of a temporary family unit, although that gets really difficult and problematic as colonization goes on, because of the way interracial children are legally and socially recognized. After a while, after a few generations, once these early colonies become more settled and more stable, Europe does start sending over European women, because obviously the long-term reality of mixed race families is not part of colonization's dream. So white women, women in country marriages who have no legal rights are abandoned by their husbands. Their children might be abandoned, or their children might be taken from them to live with these European families. But white women come in and essentially replace their indigenous counterparts. And these lead to a lot of displaced women, women who would face kind of a cultural in-between place and maybe no longer be recognized in the same way by their indigenous communities. So there's a lot of violence and damage done, and that's a hugely exploitative practice that, again, really ties into the way gender as a form, and gender and gendered labor was a big part of early colonization. Second, I need some water. As I mentioned yesterday, there is a fair amount of legalese this week, so I understand that this can be kind of dense, but I think if we're staying with the tour, and if you need to come back to this recording later or look at the slides, know that this is here. You know, from the beginning of colonization, there start to be a series of acts and government regulations that deal with the way Indigenous people are going to be handled by the government and are going to be controlled, mandated, what they're allowed to do. So there's a series of acts almost from the beginning. One of the kind of most sweeping early acts is called the Gradual Enfranchisement Act of 1869. And this has to do largely with the enforcement of what defines an Indian status, quote unquote. It does establish that Indian status is a prerequisite to land ownership. So that any person who is Indigenous who loses that status also loses the right to land ownership. It also introduces the concept of the fact that if a woman, an Indigenous woman marries a white man, that she loses her status as an Indian, and then she loses any land rights, and that her children also will be born are not eligible for Indian status. It does not work the other way around with gender. So if an Indigenous man marries a white woman, he does not lose his status. His children will have status as well. Indigenous women who married another Indigenous man from another band would be forced to join that band and would lose the ability to participate in the local government and culture of their birth. And again, this formalizes the fact that women could not hold formal roles in Indigenous government of any kind. Why it is called the Gradual Enfranchisement Act. So the idea of marrying out and losing status was tried. I mean, governments kind of pitched this as a good thing because theoretically what that meant is that if an Indigenous woman married a white man, she lost her Indian status, but supposedly gained the status of a white woman, which meant she became enfranchised. So enfranchisement was something that the government pushed for and tried to make it seem like that was the goal because that was assimilation. And theoretically, white women, theoretically, white women had more rights and privileges than Indigenous women. So they tried to pitch it as something that Indigenous women should want. That's a manipulative tactic because what it actually does is it decreases the amount of Indigenous people with Indigenous status. So it destabilizes any existing Indigenous cultures. It diminishes the amount of people working in Indigenous government, or especially when it comes to children, because I think the reading talks about the fact is that because of this, we, like hundreds of generations of non-status children, men and women, were born. So that's kind of what enfranchisement means. The next major, this is something you maybe have heard before, and definitely is going to come up through the course of today more, is the Indian Act. So again, this takes a lot of the existing acts that have come in the decades and century before and kind of consolidates them. And then this kind of becomes the de facto. There are amendments made over the next 100 years to this, but this kind of becomes the centralizing document of Indigenous regulation. Again, it's very much aimed at erasing and eradicating First Nation culture. It is about assimilating. So it is about restricting cultural practices, using using Canadian land to practice any Indigenous religious rights or cultural practices is outlawed. It bars women from having any voting decisions in lands. It creates more restrictions for the status of women. It kind of really focuses on the kind of idea of racial purity from a female lineage. So it's looking increasingly for ways to disqualify people from Indian status to destabilize and dilute those communities. I'm going to jump ahead to 1951. So in 1951, there is a major amendment to the Indian Act. this actually comes as a response to World War II. In World War II and the fallout of World War II, one of the reasons that's theorized that so much like social justice work happens in the like late 50s to the 60s and 70s is because World War II really opens up people's eyes to the brutality of war and to the way marginalized people are treated on a global scale. So we actually get a lot of social justice movements as a result of the horrors of World War II, of like concentration camps and internment camps. So ironically, the Indian Act of Amendment 1951 is a response to this and is seen as a way to actually make restrictions around Indigenous life less horrific. And it does that for men, and it does actually decriminalize a lot of cultural practices. It's no longer illegal to practice cultural religious ceremonies. It's no longer illegal to do this on land, to secure land for this. A lot of land ownership is released. However, it becomes a lot more punitive for women. Women, as part of their loss of status if they marry, again, this is all kind of organized around the marry out concept, but women lose even more. So any resources from bans or treaties, any resource development that the government offers to kind of help Indigenous people, if a woman is married out, she can't access that. And that includes things like post-secondary education for Indigenous people, daycare, housing policies that are aimed at dealing with inequality towards racialized and Indigenous people, health benefits, tax exemptions. So the Indian Act of the amendment to the Indian Act of 51 actually makes it quite a bit worse for the gendered aspects of the Indian Act. The Rights for Indian Women movement, which we talked about a little bit last week when we looked at feminist early feminism. So two major cases that, I mean, again, this happens over the course of several decades, but two major cases that kind of work as flashpoints for the movement. In 71, two women sue for discrimination, and they try and use the Human Rights Code to show that the Indian Act is in direct conflict with the Human Rights Code. So Jeanette Corbière-Lavelle sues after her name is removed from a banned list after marriages. And Yvonne Bedard sues after she's evicted from a house that her mother leaves to her in her will. And they both lose in court. And this does work perversely in a way to further like stir a lot of anger that ends up galvanizing the movement in some ways that is helpful. This leads to the Maliseet community's form of resistance that happens, and it's organized around Sandra Lovelace, who actually appeals to the United Nations. So takes this to a global body and uses actually the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that is drawn up by the United Nations to prove that the Indian Act is in violation of those things. And this stipulates that minorities are able to enjoy and practice their culture and religion and use their language, and as it relates to the community group they're from. And so Lovelace is actually successful, and the community that rallies around her helps her to be recognized by the United Nations. And this does a really good job of shaming Canada on a global scale. And this is usually what is seen as doing the work that allows the eventual reformation of the Indian Act in 1985, which leads to women, essentially leads to the end of the marrying out laws. So women no longer lose their Indian status if they marry someone who is not Indigenous. It also works retroactively, so people or the descendants of people who lost their status marrying out, have that restored. So that's a great victory. It comes pretty late. And it does, I think, hopefully shows the continuing legacy, not legacy, like the continuing practice of colonization, because I think very often we think about colonization as a historical detail. And certainly today we're talking about the history of colonization because that's good. That's really important to know. But colonization is not something that just happened in the past. It continues. So the last thing I want to talk about in this section is the way colonization has impacted sex and gender identity. So as I mentioned at the beginning, prior to colonization, Indigenous peoples had concepts of gender identity and sexuality that did not conform to Christian and European understandings of that, and were tied to pretty distinct ways to their cultural and social practices. So the way that gender identity and sexuality was expressed was connect to the culture of Indigenous communities. Again, the term Badaki was used by colonizers to refer to Indigenous people based on their understanding of a binary system, and basically used as a term for someone who did not fit into that. Gender diversity and sexuality, again, when we talk about Indigenous cultures, it's really important that we hear the S in the word cultures. There were innumerable, like many, many different bands, and that there was not a single, another problem with the word Badaki is that it was used to all non-gender conforming peoples, and different tribes had different ways of organizing gender and sexuality, and had different roles for those individuals. Two-spirit is a term I hope you've heard before, and two-spirit is both a response to the erasure of Indigenous sexuality and gender, and also an identity category. So I didn't know this, I learned this year, that the word and the concept two-spirit was actually chosen in Winnipeg in '94 at a Native American gay and lesbian gathering. It's defined as an indigenously defined Pan-American term that refers to the diversity of Aboriginal LGBTQ identities, as well as culturally specific non-gender identities. So for one, two-spirit is a way of acknowledging that there is a long history of Indigenous people, Indigenous cultures having a seat at the table, having a social function and role for people who did not fit in to a binary gender or sexuality. In many, many cultures, people who self-identified as neither male nor woman fulfilled really specific roles in the community, but were part of that community. This also sometimes, but not always, had to do with their sexuality and their sexual attraction. And so much of that has been lost. We don't have a lot of words left for those. Those were erased, and Indigenous people were taught to hate those people. And part of colonization has actually been implanting and importing homophobia and transphobia into communities that didn't have a sense of that. So the word two-spirit is, I mean, when we say things like, you know, two-spirit people have been around for thousands of years in Indigenous communities, that is true. The word two-spirit itself is relatively new, and it actually is a response to that erasure. Two-spirit also refers to people living today who identify as LGBT and Indigenous, who may identify with the concept of being two-spirit, which is a distinctly Indigenous thing. So technically speaking, the term refers to the concept of having two spirits in one body and the spiritual and cultural significance of that. Again, that's not exactly how every tribe understood it, but it is like a general concept that is recognized and that people have reclaimed as a way to assert their autonomy over their gender identity in opposition to colonialism. Over 200 languages spoken in North America were said to have contained words for individuals who were neither man nor woman. Again, we've lost so many of those. Historically speaking, and it's really important we don't romanticize this, because that can happen a lot when we look at colonialism. But two-spirited people historically served important and really distinct functions in tribes, such as being teachers, knowledge keepers, healers, herbalists, childminders, spiritual leaders, interpreters, mediators, and artists. I think I said this on the first day or second day, that there's actually many non-Christian cultures incorporated gender diversity into their spirituality. So it was actually very common, like, globally, that someone who did not self-identify within the binary would have a spiritual status, or that spiritual rituals for a lot of cultures would incorporate a form of blurring gender binary, because that was associated with spirituality and divinity. yeah, and finally, that there are many people who self-identify as two-spirit as an identity, as a way of asserting their indigenous intersectionality with their LGBT2 identity. I just want to draw your attention lastly to the person in the center above in the red mask. That's Kent Monkman, is a Canadian artist who's a two-spirit Cree Canadian artist. He's fantastic and does a lot of really interesting work about like colonial imagery and kind of talking back to more traditional problematic colonial art. So if you want to Google Kent Monkman later, he's really fabulous. I'm going to pause because we're going at about 90 minutes. So why don't we take a break and then we will come back. Let's take 10. We'll take 10 minutes. It's now 2:30. We'll come back at 2:40. Okay, we're back. We had a nice little break and you got to step away from your computer. Um, so yeah, so I first just wanted to ask if folks have any questions or anything to add, or they want more clarification on about lecture. So you can again, you can type in the chat. So someone has said that the history of gynecology has actually involved a lot of experimentation and testing on enslaved women that lots of folks are unaware of. Someone has also pointed out, and this is a really good point, that there is currently a move away from the word slave as a noun and to instead refer to people as enslaved people, enslaved men, enslaved women, because it does, it focuses on them as people. To say, you know, if you use slave as a noun, it actually tends to define someone by that. And it kind of says that that is their primary identity and almost inherently so, whereas an enslaved person, the noun is person and enslaved is something that's happened to them. So that's one reason that I'm unfortunately guilty of using them both. And that's something I can definitely work on. But if you hear that and you're kind of aware of that difference, that's a reason why. Are there any other questions or comments about the readings or the lecture? Okay, that's totally fine. If you have more, you can always put them in the chat. You can email me at any time. So I'm thinking, so it's now 2:45 and I am aware I did promise you I would go over some thesis stuff, and we also have a viewing. So I think what I'm gonna do for today is we're gonna take a little quick pivot towards, I say pivot a lot today. We're gonna do a quick pivot towards looking at the paper and looking at a thesis, because I think that is something helpful that you should be looking at in the next couple of days. And it will let you kind of get started. And then we will come back to the topic of the film. I've got a little just info to share with you about the film's subject matter. And then I think we'll end with the film. So we won't come back at the end to talk about it. We'll just save that for tomorrow, because 3 hours is a lot and the topic can be quite intense, and I understand that. And I myself am starting to feel that. So I think we'll do that. I'm just going to double check to see if there are any questions. Someone said they're enjoying the lecture, and I appreciate that. I'm enjoying the class too, and I'm glad to hear you are too. Okay, so I'm gonna bring you back into my screen. Where's that? PowerPoint, that's it. Great. Cool. So you've already seen this, and again, this is available on the Moodle in a new section under assignments. What I've asked you to do for your term paper is to pick 2 or 3 readings, or case studies or like screenings we've watched, and write a paper that critically engages with or responds to one of these prompts. And my expectation is that you're going to use one of these prompts to write your own thesis. So the prompts include: what is the relationship between gender and power? How do instances of gender identity or gender regulation from the past affect the lives and rights of people in the 21st century? How does gender impact access to services, spaces, or rights? What is the relationship between gender and health? Imagine you're debating someone who has just said gender and race are completely separate phenomena. Write an essay that responds to and argues against this statement. Or if you'd like to, you can come up with your own topic, but you need to get approval from me over email or from office hours, and you should do that by the end of this week. And I do just want to remind you that you should be looking at readings. So if you're doing like 2 readings, you should be looking at readings for different classes. So you should not pick 2 readings from the same class. If you have this really strong feeling you want to do that and you think you can make it work, email me and ask. I'm generally open to you doing something you feel really strongly about, and that's always a great. Doing something that is interesting and you feel passionately about is like the best approach to academic writing. So if you have a way to do that, amazing. My reason for this rule, and then I'll talk about this a bit, thesis, is that when you do 2 readings from the same week, you're very likely looking at 2 readings that are already in close conversation with each other, and your ability to contrast them rather than just summarize diminishes. It's a lot harder. So, I mean, if you look at 2 readings on health, it is much easier to fall into the trap of just kind of doing a book report of those, as opposed to like critically examining things and forming a thesis that's an argument rather than a summary. So that's the reason for that rule. But again, if you have 2 readings from the same week and you have an idea of how to make it work, I'm open to that, but you must check that with me. So what is the thesis is a great question. So again, you will take the prompts and you will craft a thesis. A thesis is a statement that you put in your opening chapter, and it is the mission statement of your essay. And very often theses start with like, in this essay, I will argue that X, or in this thesis, I will prove that X. So it is like, it's the mission statement, and it tells me that you have a focus of your paper, and your paper is actively trying to do something. So again, these prompts are topics that you will use to write a thesis. These are not your thesis. So what makes a good thesis? So a good thesis will argue or defend a position. One of the prompts I use for this, like one of the options of a prompt, are to literally frame it as an argument towards a hypothetical person. I always think that's a good idea. If you can think of your ideal reader as someone who is on the opposite side of an issue, and your goal as the writer is to convince them using evidence of your position, that is a very useful way to conceive of this kind of writing. Good theses will use active language. So words like argue, examine, or prove. I find in a lot of good theses, because they are really specific, and they show me that you have a goal in mind in the writing. You want the writing to do something specific. They're interpreting the essay question. So you have taken one of my prompts and you have turned it into something. You've done some thinking about it, and you've put some original thinking into that, and you've turned it into something different. And then a good thesis will engage with specific readings from the class. So it is clear from your thesis the way you're going to use your readings. You don't necessarily name your readings in the thesis, but it does connect to the readings from the class. And we can talk about that more. We talk about writing your intro paragraph. Some warning signs that your thesis might not be a strong thesis, might be a weak thesis. And it's okay if your first draft of your thesis does some of these things, because sometimes you have a first idea and then you can come back to it and retool it. So a weak thesis will often define a general theme or topic, but doesn't have a specific argument. So, in this essay, I will discuss the role of power and gender. It's like, okay, that's not really arguing anything. And that brings my next point, is that weak theses will use more general language, such as explore, consider, review, discuss. Remember, a good thesis has more specific language like argue, examine, and prove. A weak thesis might simply repeat my prompt back to me. And so you haven't interpreted it in a specific way. A weak thesis probably doesn't connect to any specific texts. So it's, again, weak theses are quite general and might not engage with the text. And probably the biggest trap you should avoid is a weak thesis sets you up to just kind of summarize the readings rather than using them as evidence to make a point. So again, I've said this before, but one of the key things of like a first year introductory university class like this is we're trying to get you to a place in your writing where you are not just summarizing, where you're actually arguing something and you're using the readings to prove a point. many high school level classes, the goal is to kind of get you to a point where you can summarize accurately. And that's really important because without accuracy, you can't argue. But now at a university level, just summarizing the text is not enough. So no, if you write a paper that is just like, I'm just going to summarize these 2 readings we did, that's not what I'm looking for. That's not meeting the expectations of the assignment. You have to get to the point where you're able to argue something. And the thesis is your foundation for that. And it will tell you what you're trying to argue. And a thesis will help you guide the rest of your paper. Because once you write a first draft and you're reading it, you use your thesis to check to make sure all of your paragraphs are doing what you promised they would do. And thesis is a really useful tool because you'll check every paragraph and be like, does this support my thesis? And if it doesn't, it's the paragraph needs work. It might not be a good paragraph. It might not be your paragraph. You might need to retool it or to cut it. But yeah, the thesis is really important because it sets up your foundation for your writing. So that is my pitch for now. Tomorrow, we're going to play good thesis, bad thesis. I'd like, if you can, to just start thinking about your thesis over the next 24 hours. If you have one tomorrow, amazing. Don't worry if you don't have one yet, but we will kind of talk in slightly more concrete terms about writing a thesis. And we'll also look at the intro paragraph tomorrow and kind of the role that does in your term paper. I'm gonna stop sharing now. Do I have any questions about the thesis so far? Or the term paper? That's okay. Oh, thank you. I'm glad that was helpful. Someone is asking me if we can use today's lecture to help with the term paper discussion. Do you mean using the lecture? Using the lecture to like using the lecture as a text, or do you mean like using colonialism as one of the topics? Great question. You can refer to lecture in your paper, absolutely. And if it is helpful and kind of contextualize what you're talking about, you can refer to lecture. But it does not count as one of the texts. So you still need to use at least 2. So it can't be like, I'm going to discuss, I'm going to discuss Hooks and Cameron's lecture. It needs to be, it can just be supplementary, and that's fine. That's a great question. If you use lecture content in our essay, does it have to be cited? No. No. I think for the purposes, because you're writing for this class, and this is essentially something everyone has access to, I'm not going to ask you to cite my lecture. Be aware if you were in if this was like a 4th year level class, or you were writing for publication, you would have to, and there's a way to do that. But I want you all to focus on just getting like really clear skills on just kind of text-based citation. So we're going to suspend that rule for now. Good question. Also, like just thinking about, do I cite this? Should I cite this? How do I cite this? It's always a good question. I wrote an article this past summer on like online drag performance, and I had to find out how do I cite a TikTok? How do I cite like a live stream? And things I'd never thought about before. And there are answers, and it's tricky, and that's just kind of an ongoing thing. So I think if you get used to thinking of asking those questions, that's gonna be really helpful as you kind of continue academically, because those are good things to be aware of, that anytime we reference someone, we probably should be citing it. How do we do that? So great questions. Okay, so I'm just going to give a little preamble to the film we're watching, and then we'll break for today, and I'll let you watch it on your own, and then I think we'll take up the movie tomorrow when we come back. it'll also give you a chance if you need to take a break to sit with some of the lecture before you watch the movie, because the movie is a little heavy. That's fine too, and you have the autonomy to do that with your time. Okay, cool. So I'm going to take my one more screen share to take us home. Okay, so that's your thesis. What is happening? Great. So we're watching a film. We're watching a film about the residential school system in Canada, which is a difficult topic, and is a topic that's not been discussed a lot historically, and that's part of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is about, which the film talks about. So residential schools were forced, mandatory schools run by the government, boarding schools in which Indigenous youth from the age of 7 to 16 were taken, sometimes younger, but were taken forcibly from their families. It was based on a belief that the best way to assimilate Indigenous people was by separating them from their families at a young age. About socializing them and educating them aggressively and taking them out of the family unit to do that, because of the knowledge that cultural practices are passed down by family, and that kinship and familial knowledge is a big part of cultural integrity. In the residential school system, the focus was on violently prohibiting any Indigenous cultural practices and submitting to colonial authority, and also training people in gender-specific low-pay work. So, speaking any Indigenous language was punished by violence. Any cultural practices were punished by violence. Asking questions about Indigenous topics were punished by violence. Children's hair were cut uniformly and were given European clothes. And much of the formal education, the film doesn't talk about this a ton, but much of the formal education was actually educating and training Indigenous people to work in very low-end, unstable, low-paying jobs that ascribe to very specific gender roles in the European culture. So teaching male children to work in manual labor and unskilled maintenance, teaching women to work, teaching young girls to work in domestic support roles and cleaning roles. And so the labor and the division of bodies was extremely gendered within the residential school system. I also want you to think about, as you're watching, just how we talked about the role of or the concept that colonialism is patriarchal by design. Is something I think to keep in mind. So just a couple of dates I'm going to give you just to give you some context of the history of this. The film we're watching focuses a little more on the recent history of residential schools, but it is quite a long history. So the first residential school in Canada opened in 1831, the Mohawk Institute in Ontario. Initially, it was all male, but it did start admitting girls as early as 1834, and it was run by the Anglican Church. By 1896, there were over 40 residential schools across Canada. In 1907, there was a commission run by the government that saw that there were poor health conditions, and actually the report found that 25% of children in residential schools were dying, which is a huge number, and that actually children who left residential schools died at a rate of 69% from a series of trauma, prolonged health conditions, mental health conditions, the fact that the residential school system cut children off from support networks. So when children left, they often weren't welcomed back into their communities. They had no culture and community to go back to. So the rate of poverty among survivors of residential school was astronomical, and lack of services were very, very high. Lack of services were high. It's a bit of a, yeah. By 1920, residential schools became mandatory for all First Nation children between the age of 7 and 16. By the year 1930, there were more than 80 institutes opening across Canada, and the enrollment nationally was 17,000. And this marks the highest rate. This is the time in history where there were the most number of active residential schools. In 1966, a 12-year-old boy named Charlie Wenjack was died trying to escape a residential school, and the issue did receive national attentions. There was a trial, and the jury, and it's worth noting that this was an all-white jury, found the residential schools did cause tremendous emotional and psychological problems. And a study was issued on the present situation of Indian education. This and other activist organizations throughout the civil rights era did start the closure of some schools. So by 1977, that's still quite a large number, 28 residential schools remained. Children were displaced very often because children who were taken into residential schools were kind of taken, often taken off the streets, taken from children or taken from families without prodigious record keeping. So children that, when residential schools closed, many children were simply displaced. Some were just sent to foster care, very often white foster families, some were out of Canada. So the closing of residential schools did not necessarily mean kind of a form of like justice or safety for children who were no longer in the system, because the damage had already been done in a lot of ways, and the fallout was extremely problematic in and of itself. In 1990, Phil Fontaine, who was the head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, spoke out publicly about the abuses he had suffered at a residential school, and he called for an inquiry into schools, which the federal government initiated in 1991. Brian Mulroney initiated an examination into the residential school system. And this is a trend we also kind of see in the 80s and 90s as survivors of the residential school system, and particularly those who had managed to find a way to some kind of like recognition on a governmental or a public level, started to speak out about their experiences. That did a fair amount to draw attention to the issue. So the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996, which is very recent, definitely in my lifetime. I'm imagining in many of our lifetimes. So again, when we think of residential schools, we usually get a lot of images of kind of like a black and white photography, and it is treated as a historical issue. But the fact that this was still going on till the end of the 20th century is important to note. So again, we're watching this film. We're watching Canada's Dark Secret. It's a documentary from 2019. So one thing to note is that there are discussions and descriptions, verbal descriptions of violence, sexual assault, rape. I understand it's quite difficult to watch. And so if anyone does feel like they need to opt out for their own safety, that is fine. I also think it's a really important film to be aware of. When I was talking earlier about me broadening a bit the focus of this particular lecture, this isn't a documentary on gender. This isn't a documentary on gender and colonialism. I think this is an important film, whether or not you watch it today, to be aware of that it's out there. And it's certainly a film that if you want to, you can write about for your term paper, and that I hope broadens your knowledge of the reading we did do on gender and colonialism. I also think it is helpful to, again, think about colonialism itself as a patriarchal practice, the role of colonialism, of taking control of children, of seeing Indigenous peoples as treating them as children who need to be controlled and managed and civilized, and the role of kind of paternal influence over cultural genocide. So the fact that the residential school system recognized that family and domestic life and access to mothers and fathers and to maternal and paternal lines was a part of the way culture was passed on. And so a school that was a live-in school, a school that blocked their access to families, was a tool of colonialism. So that's worth noting. So I will leave it there today, and we can absolutely take this up And yeah, and again, the content warning is there and there's truly no pressure to engage. But I think it is, even if you don't watch it today, it's good to know that it's here. The link, it is on YouTube. The link is on the Moodle site. If anyone has any questions for now, we can do that, and we should. Someone has asked me, this is a great question. The link I sent out, this is so weird when YouTube does this. The link I sent out starts at 11 minutes. No, I think I was just in the middle of watching it when I uploaded it. I was rewatching it to take my notes. So no, start at the beginning. Great question. I did not know YouTube did that, that it does a timestamp.
So we can find this on YouTube.
You can find it on YouTube, but I actually put the YouTube link on the Moodle, so you can click it there if you have any trouble looking at it. I'm just getting a thing. So someone has pointed out that like the Indigenous children are overrepresented in I believe foster care, and in different kind of like government networks that manage children, and that's a continuation of the residential school system. Like, yeah, like I think if there is one thing I want you to take away from today is the fact that like colonialism is an ongoing process, and the violence of colonialism still exists and continues, both in terms of the aftermath of things that have only stopped recently, but also in systems that continue to perpetuate them. So the closing of residential schools is definitely a step in the right direction, but to say that the system that generated those schools and like the cultural legacy of ongoing erasure still continues. So to definitely, like, again, this happens a lot in Canadian studies classes where people kind of walk away being, it's like, wow, colonialism is a bad part of our history. It's like, yes, and colonialism is a bad part of our present and potentially future. Colonialism is something that is very much still active. So that's something I think to be really aware of. Thank you. So I got a lovely note just thanking me. I appreciate that. I also appreciate for all of you that this takes both intellectual and emotional work to engage with this topic. So I do appreciate you, signing on today, doing the readings, and yeah, thank you. So we're gonna break today, because if you start watching now, you'll basically finish at the end of the class, 10 minutes to go. So thank you again for a really great class. I will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we're doing the readings on gender and healthcare, and we will start the class by taking up the film for those that want to. And if you have any questions about the term paper or any of the readings, I'll stick around for a few minutes now, or you can email me or come to office hours. Okay, bye folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. For the term paper, so say we should choose one topic out of the one you sent.
Sorry, can you say that again?
For the term paper. Yeah, so like I'm trying to use what's the relationship between gender and between gender. Let me check the questions. So yeah, the relationship between gender and health.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, so like you said, can I use like because we watched Modern Family.
Yeah.
So like can I talk about that while I'm talking about like can I relate that to the assignment?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say you'd want to look at one of the readings from Health that we're doing tomorrow, but yeah, you can absolutely use the Modern Family viewing.
Can I use like let's see now I used for the last assignment media response.
Mhm.
I used French, so can I talk about I have to use the one we used in class.
Oh, that's a good question. If you want to bring in, like, if you want to use a movie or TV show from outside of class, I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to use French.
Sure. Yeah.
So I can do that. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Megan, did you have a question? Okay, I'm gonna sign off for today. I'll see you folks tomorrow.
Bye.